The fog clung to the ancient oaks like a shroud, twisting through the underbrush where the old Hargrove plantation had once stood proud and merciless. Now, in the hush of twilight on a forgotten edge of Louisiana, the woods whispered secrets that no living soul should hear. Eliza Thorne pulled her coat tighter against the chill that seeped not from the air, but from the ground itself, as if the earth remembered the weight of chains and unspoken sins. She'd come here chasing ghosts in her bloodline, armed with nothing but a crumpled DNA report and a nagging dread that had started as curiosity but now gnawed at her like hunger. The report had arrived in a plain envelope, its contents a map of betrayals, markers linking her to a lineage of mixed heritage, shadowed by the specter of slavery. Her great-great-grandmother, Eleanor Hargrove, widowed in 1858 at the tender age of 28, had ruled over this land with an iron fist wrapped in lace. 5 children, the record said, born in the years that followed, each one a scandal buried in parish ledgers, their fathers unnamed but whispered to be the very men she owned. But the DNA whispered louder, revealing a pattern that chilled Eliza to her core, not random passions, but something deliberate, a rhythm echoing through generations like a curse unspoken. As night deepened, the woods came alive with sounds that defied the silence. Branches creaked without wind, and from the depths, faint voices rose, murmurs of anguish, pleas in dialects long faded, calling names that twisted in the air. Eliza froze by her flickering campfire, heart pounding as the first whisper brushed her ear, "She took us, one by one." The dark pattern was awakening, and in the shadows of the trees, the mystery hidden in the woods waited to claim its next heir. Eliza Thorne had always been the quiet archivist of her family's past, the one who organized faded photographs into albums and chased down birth certificates for cousins she barely knew. Genealogy was her refuge, a tidy grid of names and dates that promised order in a chaotic world. So when the plain white envelope from the DNA company arrived on a rainy Thursday in October, she opened it with the same mild anticipation she felt every time a new batch of records went online. The first page was routine, pie charts of ethnicity, predictable bands of English, Irish, and German drifting across the screen when she logged into her account. She almost closed the tab. Then the DNA matches section loaded, and the tidy grid shattered. A cluster of high-confidence matches appeared, people she had never heard of, all sharing between 12 and 18% of her DNA. Their profile names were ordinary, Johnson 87, LaTanya_M, Friesen 63, but their family trees converged on a single place, Willow Bend Plantation, St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, circa 1850 to 1870. Stranger still, every one of them listed an ancestor born into slavery. Eliza's stomach tilted. Her own tree, meticulously documented back to the 1790s, had always stopped at Eleanor Hargrove, the iron-willed widow who inherited Willow Bend in 1858 and never remarried. She clicked deeper. The shared segments were massive, centromere-to-centromere blocks that screamed recent common ancestry, not the distant collateral lines she expected. The algorithm offered its blunt conclusion: these matches were second or third cousins, descended from the same grandparents as Eliza herself. Which could only mean one thing. Somewhere in the shaded branches of her tree, hidden behind euphemisms like natural child or simply left blank, Eleanor had given birth to children whose fathers were enslaved men on her own land. Eliza sat back, the glow of the laptop carving harsh shadows across her face. The matches had uploaded scanned documents, a faded 1866 Freedmen's Bureau record listing a boy named Isaac Hargrove, colored, age 8, mother Eleanor Hargrove, father unknown, an 1870 census page where 4 more children appeared, each marked mulatto, each carrying the Hargrove surname that should never have been granted under Louisiana law. 5 children in total, born at precise intervals between 1859 and 1871. 5 different fathers, the DNA now insisted, because the genetic signatures refused to overlap the way full siblings would. The room felt suddenly too small. Eliza had spent years polishing her family's story into something respectable, planters, yes, but benevolent ones, or so the old letters claimed. Now pixels on a screen were ripping the varnish away, revealing rot beneath. The past wasn't content to stay buried, it had mailed itself to her doorstep in a plain white envelope, demanding she look directly at what her blood had done, and what had been done to it. The deeper Eliza dug, the more the archives coughed up fragments of Eleanor Hargrove as if the paper itself resented keeping her secrets. Parish conveyance records painted the first clear picture. In the spring of 1858, at the age of 28, Eleanor had stood alone in the St. Landry courthouse clutching a freshly inked deed. Her husband, Auguste Hargrove, had died 3 weeks earlier, thrown from his horse on a moonless ride home from Opelousas. The coroner called it misadventure, the neighbors called it convenient. Auguste left no will, no close male kin, and no children. Under Louisiana's Napoleonic Code, every acre of Willow Bend Plantation, 2,000 arpents of cane and cypress, a sugar mill that belched smoke from dawn to dusk, and 143 human souls listed as property, passed intact to his widow. Contemporary accounts described Eleanor as slight, almost fragile in appearance, with pale hair always pinned severely and eyes the color of winter river ice. Mourning became her like armor. She wore black bombazine for the rest of her life, yet within months of the funeral she was writing the boundaries herself, ledger in hand, correcting overseers twice her age with a voice that could flay skin. The men who had expected a grieving girl they could cheat found instead a woman who knew the yield of every field to the hogshead and the temperament of every enslaved driver by name. Court filings from 1859 showed her refusing 3 separate offers of marriage from respectable planters who coveted both the land and the chance to protect her. She dismissed them all with the same terse note: Willow Bend has a mistress and requires no master. Taxes were paid on time, debts retired early, new boilers installed in the mill. By 1861, when war choked the Mississippi and sugar prices soared, Eleanor Hargrove was one of the wealthiest widows in the Attakapas, presiding over a domain that swallowed light and gave nothing back. Yet in every record her solitude stood out like a missing tooth. No sister traveled to comfort her, no mother came to live in the great house after Auguste's death. Portraits showed her seated alone beneath Spanish moss, hands folded, mouth set in a line that suggested smiling had been bred out of her years before. The big house at Willow Bend, white columns, green shutters, galleries wide enough to dance on, echoed with the footsteps of one woman and the silent labor of many who were forbidden to speak unless spoken to. By the time the first child arrived in December 1859, the plantation had already begun its slow transformation into something between kingdom and tomb, ruled by a widow who answered to no law but her own. The evidence arrived in pieces, each more damning than the last. First came the sacramental registers of St. Charles Borromeo in Grand Coteau, pages brittle and water-stained, where a priest had dutifully recorded 5 baptisms between 1859 and 1871. Every entry listed the mother as Madame Veuve Auguste Hargrove, and every infant as Legitime par subsequent mariage, a polite ecclesiastical fiction when no marriage ever followed. The column for the father was left blank in 4 cases. In the 5th, a single word had been scratched out so violently the paper tore. Then the Freedmen's Bureau contracts surfaced in a dusty box at the National Archives Annex in Fort Worth. In 1865, when federal agents finally reached St. Landry Parish, they found dozens of formerly enslaved people still living on Willow Bend under yearly labor agreements. Among the signatories were 5 men: Josiah, age 32, Gabriel, 29, Samson, 35, Luke, 27, and Cato, 31, each described as of dark complexion, and each listed with an X beside his name, the mark of someone never taught to write. Every contract contained an identical, handwritten marginal note in Eleanor's unmistakable spidery script: "Father of my child, to remain on place." Census takers in 1870 were less delicate. They strode into the great house and wrote what they saw: Eleanor Hargrove, white, female, 40, keeping house, then 5 children: Isaac, 11, Delphine, 9, Auguste, 7, Celeste, 4, Victor, 1, all marked M4 mulatto, all bearing the Hargrove surname. The enumerator added his own observation in the remarks column, said children reputed to be issue of the widow with various colored men formerly enslaved here. When the deputy assessor returned the following year to collect taxes on the children as property, Louisiana still clung to pre-war habits. Eleanor met him on the gallery with a shotgun across her lap and informed him her children were free-born American citizens. He left without argument. DNA filled in the final, irrefutable strokes. The 5 modern descendants who matched Eliza carried distinct Y chromosome lines, meaning 5 separate paternal ancestors. When Eliza overlaid the birth years against the ages of the men on the 1865 contracts, the alignment was exact: Josiah for Isaac, Gabriel for Delphine, Samson for Auguste, Luke for Celeste, Cato for Victor. No overlap, no shared paternal markers among the siblings. 5 mothers by law, 1 mother by blood, and 5 fathers who had once been listed on the same inventory as mules and copper kettles. The parish whispered that Eleanor had taken lovers from among the quarters. The records now screamed she had taken 5, deliberately, methodically, in a sequence that felt less like passion and more like design. The births were too evenly spaced to be accidents of desire. Isaac arrived December 1859, almost exactly 9 months after Auguste's funeral, as if Eleanor had wasted no time beginning whatever plan she carried in silence. Then Delphine in March 1862, Auguste in September 1864, Celeste in February 1868, Victor in November 1871. 3 years, give or take a season, between each child, a cadence that mocked the chaos of war and Reconstruction alike. While Louisiana burned and rebuilt itself, while armies marched and cotton kings fell, Willow Bend's mistress produced heirs with the calm regularity of a metronome. Eliza noticed the second pattern only after she plotted every known event on a single timeline. In the spring of 1859, 3 months before Isaac's conception, an enslaved cooper named Josiah was moved from the sugar house gang to the big house for carpentry duties. He never returned to the fields. In the autumn of 1861, weeks before Delphine was conceived, Gabriel, a skilled blacksmith, vanished from the quarterly head count. The overseer's log noted simply, "Now resides in mistress's service." The same phrase appeared again and again, always just before a new pregnancy. Samson the driver in 1863, Luke the groom in 1867, Cato the gardener in 1870. Each man disappeared from the slave rolls, later the labor rolls, at the precise moment his seed would take root. But the disappearances did not end with reassignment. After each birth, within a month of the child drawing its first breath, the father's name stopped appearing altogether. Not sold, no bill of sale ever surfaced, not run away, no reward notices in the Opelousas Patriot, not dead, no burial entries in the Plantation book. They simply ceased. The 1870 census listed only 3 adult black males still working Willow Bend, all too old or too young to match the missing 5. By 1873, when Victor was toddling and Eleanor was 43, the great house staff consisted of elderly women and children. Every man who had once shared her bed had been quietly, thoroughly erased. Eliza's hands shook as she aligned the final column: conception, birth, disappearance. The rhythm was merciless. Each man entered her orbit, gave her a child, and then vanished into whatever silence she arranged for him. Passion might stagger, this did not. This was harvest. And the DNA, merciless in its own way, now showed the same unerring pattern repeating down the generations, segments passed intact, almost preserved, as if the blood itself refused to dilute what Eleanor had begun. The widow had not merely broken every law of God and man, she had done it on a schedule, and the land itself seemed to have kept the count. Eliza left New Orleans before dawn, the rental car's headlights carving tunnels through the low-lying fog that pooled along Bayou Teche. The GPS lost its mind somewhere past Arnaudville and simply gave up, leaving her to follow a hand-drawn map sketched from satellite photos and half-remembered childhood stories. Willow Bend Plantation had never been famous enough for a historical marker. After the levee broke in 1927, the big house was abandoned, the fields reverted to swamp and second-growth cypress, and the entire tract was swallowed by a tangle of water oak and Chinese tallow the locals called the Devil's Back 40. Even the tax assessor only visited once every decade, and then with an armed deputy. She found the turnoff at dusk, 2 rusted columns half hidden under kudzu, the iron letters W and B still faintly legible beneath decades of lichen. The shell road had long since surrendered to mud and roots, so she parked and walked, boots sinking ankle-deep in black water that smelled of iron and rot. Mosquitoes rose in biblical clouds. Somewhere a gator thumped its tail against the bayou bank like a warning drum. The great house appeared suddenly, a blind, hulking thing wrapped in vines so thick they looked like cables mooring it to the earth. Every window was gone, leaving dark rectangles that stared like empty sockets. The gallery had collapsed inward years ago, spilling rotten planks across what had once been a sweeping lawn. Spanish moss hung in ragged curtains, swaying though there was no wind. Eliza set up her tent 50 yards away on a slight rise that might once have been the old carriage turnaround, the only patch of ground not underwater. Night fell with the abruptness of a theater curtain. The cicadas screamed, then stopped all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. In that vacuum of sound she heard the first voice, low, male, speaking a Creole French so old it felt carved rather than spoken. Lepran knew, she told herself it was a hunter, a poacher, anything rational, but the words drifted from every direction at once, threading through the cypress knees and the hanging moss. Later, when the moon rose green and bloated over the treetops, the voices multiplied. They were not loud, never loud enough to record on her phone, but they were intimate, brushing the inside of her ear like breath. Some pleaded, some cursed, One simply repeated a woman's name, Eleanor, over and over until it sounded less like a name and more like a wound. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of cane smoke that had no business burning in a forest abandoned for a century. And beneath every voice ran the same steady rhythm she had seen in the records, a heartbeat counted in threes, the cadence of a woman who had taken, and taken, and taken again, until the woods themselves learned to keep her time. Eliza's first night in the ruined clearing passed in fragments of half-sleep, the kind where the line between dream and waking frays like wet paper. She had zipped herself into the tent with the flashlight on, telling herself the voices were wind, frogs, her own blood rushing too loud in her ears. Around 2 in the morning the temperature dropped so sharply that her breath fogged inside the nylon. That was real enough to jolt her upright. She fumbled for the zipper and stepped barefoot onto the cold ground. The moon had set, the darkness was absolute, the sort that swallows the beam of a headlamp and gives nothing back. Only the embers of her dying fire glowed, a dull orange eye in the black. Then the murmurs began again, closer now, as though the speakers had waited for her to leave the tent's frail protection. They came from the direction of the old slave cabins, foundations long since rotted into humps of brick overgrown with poison ivy. The voices were layered, overlapping, 5 distinct timbres braided together by grief and rage. One rose above the others, deeper, slower, carrying the weight of a man who had once swung a 12-pound axe through cane from dawn to dark. "Mistress, call me, say she need me in the big house, say it gentle." Another cut across him, younger, frantic. "Door locked behind me, key turned twice, moon through the window red like blood." A third voice, hoarse, almost laughing through tears, she count the days on her fingers, 9 month, then done, then the whole waitin'. Eliza's knees buckled. She sank to the ground, palms pressed to the wet earth, and felt the vibration of their words travel up through the soil itself. The pleas were not random, they repeated in the same relentless triplet she had mapped on her timeline: conception, birth, disappearance, repeated until the rhythm matched her own pulse. She tasted iron and realized she had bitten her tongue. When she finally found the courage to shine her light toward the cabins, the beam caught nothing but vines and shadow. Yet the voices did not fade with distance, they folded themselves around her, intimate as breath against the nape of her neck. One spoke directly into her left ear, so close she felt the stir of air that should not have been there: "You carry us all, Cheel. Every drop she stole run in you now." The fire popped, sending a single spark spiraling upward, and for an instant the clearing was lit bright as noon. In that flash she saw them, 5 men standing at the edge of the trees, barefoot, in ragged Osnaburg shirts, necks strangely elongated as if something had stretched them toward the sky long ago. Then darkness rushed back in, absolute and hungry, and the only sound left was the wet thud of her own heart counting out the next inevitable beat. The journal fragment surfaced on the 3rd afternoon, wedged between 2 warped floorboards in what had once been Eleanor's private sitting room. Rain the night before had swollen the cypress planks just enough to reveal a thin brass edge glinting under decades of leaf mold. Eliza pried it free with trembling fingers, a small Morocco-bound book no larger than a prayer missal, its ribbon marker rotted to black thread. Only 12 pages remained, the rest eaten by silverfish or deliberate fire, but those 12 pages carried Eleanor's handwriting in brown iron gall ink that had bled through the paper like bruises. The first surviving entry was dated March 11, 1859, 6 days after Auguste's funeral. "I am alone now in truth. The house rings with his absence, yet the silence is sweeter than his breathing ever was. Tonight the moon is dark and the air smells of new cane. I walked to the quarters after the bell for sleep, carrying no lantern. Josiah waited where I told him, behind the cooper's shed. He trembled when I touched his face, not from desire, I think, but from the knowledge that refusal was death and acceptance was also death, only slower. I spoke softly. I have learned softness is the sharper blade. When he followed me across the lawn his bare feet made no sound on the dew. In my chamber I closed the shutters so only one thin blade of moonlight fell across the bed. I kept my mourning ring on, the gold band cut into his shoulder when I held him down. He wept afterward, quiet, like rain against the gallery roof. I tasted salt on his neck and felt the first stirring of power I have ever truly owned. Tomorrow I will send him back to the barrels and hoops, but tonight he is mine, and the child that comes will be mine twice over." A later entry, written in a steadier hand, continued the ritual's outline. "Gabriel fought less than Josiah, perhaps because he is younger and still believes tenderness can exist in this house. I gave him brandy first, laced with just enough laudanum to loosen the tongue and the limbs. He spoke of his wife sold away in Virginia, and I let him speak. Words are chains too. When he slept I traced the brands on his back, Hargrove, my own mark, and felt the child quicken already, though it is too soon. The pattern begins. 1 every 3 years, blood for land, land for blood. The old women in the quarters know, they look away when I pass. They understand bargains better than priests do. The final legible line, dated October 17, 1871, was written in larger, almost exultant strokes. Victor cried lustily at birth, darker than the rest, strong as the father I will bury before the new moon. 5 now. The circle closes. The woods are ready. The journal never used the word ritual, yet every line bled ceremony. Eleanor wrote of the moon's phases the way a sailor charts tides, new moon for calling, waxing for binding, full for taking. She marked the exact night each man was summoned, always the same phase, always the same hour when the big house clock struck 1 and the dogs were penned so their barking would not carry. She recorded the herbs she burned in a copper bowl on the hearth, rue, vervain, something she called graveyard dirt from the first Hargrove buried here, and the low Latin phrases she whispered over their skin, phrases she claimed to have copied from a book Auguste brought back from New Orleans and then hid in the attic because even he feared its pages. Each conception was followed by a second, private ceremony 3 nights later in a clearing deep in the cypress brake behind the sugar mill. There she made the men drink from a silver cup filled with river water, cane syrup, and 3 drops of her own blood drawn from the left ring finger. She wrote that the mixture tasted of iron and burnt sugar, that they gagged but swallowed because the alternative was the strap or worse. After the cup came the binding, a length of black silk cord knotted 9 times around their left wrists, the ends buried beneath a marked cypress knee. The cord, she believed, tethered their spirit to the land and to the child growing inside her. When the knot rotted, the tether snapped, and the men could be released without weakening the bargain. The children were the harvest. Each birth strengthened her, she claimed. Gray hairs turned dark again, joints that ached in winter grew supple, mirrors showed a woman who looked 30 when the calendar insisted 45. She began to speak of the plantation itself as a living thing that fed on what she fed it. The cane grew taller, the yields heavier, even during the war when every neighboring field lay fallow. Overseers who once mocked her youth now crossed themselves when she passed. The old Dahomey woman who cooked in the quarters told a Union soldier in 1863 that Miss Eleanor Dunn made a trade with the ground, and the ground always get paid. By the 5th child the pattern had calcified into something colder than lust and older than grief. Eleanor no longer bothered with tenderness or brandy. She wrote of Cato, Victor's father, only that he was, brought at dusk, silent, already understanding. The final entry hinted at an escalation. After the 5th knot was buried, the land would demand not just seed but full sacrifice, and the mistress who had started as thief would end as priestess, sealing the bargain with a life freely given, or taken, beneath the same trees that had watched every coupling. The woods, she wrote with something like rapture, were hungry for the closing of the circle. The first nightmare arrived the night after she read the journal aloud to herself, as if the words needed a living throat to wake them. In the dream Eliza stood barefoot on the gallery of the great house, but the boards were warm and pulsing, veins of red sap threading beneath the cypress-like arteries. 5 small children, Isaac, Delphine, Auguste, Celeste, Victor, played ring around the rosy in the yard, their faces shifting every time they turned, her mother's cheekbones, her own eyes, the mouth of a cousin in Baton Rouge she had never met. When they sang, the voices that came out were not children's at all but the deep, cracked baritones of the 5 men, singing in perfect, terrible harmony, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. She woke gasping, the taste of cane syrup thick on her tongue. Her left wrist burned. When she stumbled to the tent's mesh window she saw the bruise blooming there, a perfect circle of 5 knots, purple-black against her skin, though nothing had touched her in the night. The second night the dreams layered. She was Eleanor, heavy with Victor, walking the path to the clearing while Cato followed 3 paces behind, the silk cord already knotted around his wrist. But when Eleanor turned to speak, the face beneath the black veil was Eliza's own, and the voice that came out belonged to every woman in her direct line stretching back to 1858. Finish it, the voice said, not cruel, not kind, simply inevitable. 5 were taken, 5 must give back. The land remembers interest. By the 4th night the boundary thinned to tissue. She slept less than an hour before the clearing appeared again, only now the cypress knees had grown into altars, slick with moss and something darker. The 5 men waited in a semicircle, barefoot, necks bruised with the same rope marks she had glimpsed in that single spark of firelight. They did not accuse, they simply opened their shirts and showed her the hollow places where their hearts had been, cavities filled not with blood but with rich delta soil that sprouted tiny sugarcane leaves. Josiah stepped forward first and pressed his earth-filled chest against hers. She felt the seedlings take root between her ribs, cold and insistent. "Your turn to carry," he whispered, and the weight settled so completely she woke on her hands and knees in the mud, retching black water that smelled of the river and old smoke. Each morning she found new marks, another knot on the cord that was not there, a faint scar shaped like a cypress knee across. The voices stopped asking. On the 6th night they simply guided. Eliza woke before dawn with the taste of iron in her mouth and the absolute certainty of where she had to dig. She took the folding shovel from her trunk, the headlamp, and the silver cup she had found 2 days earlier half buried beneath the collapsed kitchen chimney, tarnished black but unmistakably the one Eleanor described. The clearing was waiting exactly where the dreams had placed it, a perfect circle of cypress knees 30 paces behind where the sugar mill once stood, ringed by trees so old their roots braided above the ground like the arms of drowning men. She counted 9 paces from the largest knee, the number Eleanor used for every knot, and drove the blade into the soft loam. The soil gave too easily, wet and black as if it had never dried in 150 years. 6 inches down the shovel struck something soft that yielded with a sound like a sigh. She dropped to her knees and clawed with bare hands, mud packing beneath her fingernails, until her fingers closed around a knot of rotted silk still clinging to bone. There were 5 bundles in all, arranged like spokes of a wheel, each containing a left wrist bone wrapped in the remnants of black cord. The knots had fused into the bone itself, threads turned to calcite, as permanent as petrified rope. At the hub of the wheel lay a 6th object, a small leather pouch gone hard as wood. Inside were 5 locks of hair, one from each man, braided with 5 strands of pale gold that could only have been Eleanor's own, and a single folded sheet of vellum no larger than a playing card. The ink had browned to rust, but the words were still legible, written in Eleanor's hand the night Victor was born. With the 5th seed the gate is wide. The land has drunk and is not sated. When the blood returns that once was given, the circle seals and the mistress is forgiven. Let the last of the line come willing, with open veins and open will. Then the debt is paid, the chain is broken, and Willow Bend sleeps until the next awakening. Beneath the note, pressed flat as if laid there yesterday, was a single sugarcane leaf, still green, still flexible, its edges sharp enough to draw blood when Eliza lifted it. A bead welled crimson on her thumb and fell onto the vellum. Where it struck, the ink flared like fresh flame, the letters writhing for an instant into a different sentence altogether. She is here. The woods exhaled, a long, satisfied sound that rattled every leaf at once, and in the sudden hush Eliza understood that the final act had never been about punishment. It had always been about inheritance. The clearing did not feel like a grave anymore, it felt like a church at the moment before consecration. Dawn had not yet come, but the darkness itself carried a bruised violet glow, as if the sky were a wound slowly opening. Eliza stood at the center of the wheel of bones, the silver cup in one hand and the green cane leaf in the other, and felt the 5 presences arrange themselves behind her, not as ghosts, not anymore, but as witnesses whose long wait was ending. They did not speak now. They simply waited, the way the land had waited beneath flood and fire and neglect. She understood the choice with a clarity that hurt. She could rebury the bundles, burn the journal, drive away, and let the pattern rot for another generation until some other daughter felt the knots rise on her wrist. Or she could finish what Eleanor had begun, not with another theft, but with a giving back. Eliza knelt and placed the cup in the hollow where the 6th bundle should have been. From her pocket she drew the small knife she used for cutting samples in archives, its blade no longer than her thumb. The first cut was shallow, across the heel of her left hand, the one already ringed with fading bruises. Blood welled bright and immediate, dripping into the cup with soft, deliberate sounds. She sliced again, deeper, across the right, until the silver brimmed dark and shining. Then she pressed both palms to the earth. The ground drank greedily. She felt it pull, not like sinking but like returning, blood racing down through layers of clay and root and coffin wood, threading along the old cords that had never truly rotted, finding the hollow places in 5 chests and filling them at last. A wind rose though no leaf had moved in hours, carrying the scent of crushed cane and distant rain. Somewhere far above, the first bird of morning called once and fell silent, as if the world itself held its breath. The pain ebbed suddenly, replaced by a warmth that started in her sternum and spread outward like spilled molasses. She saw, no, remembered, Josiah teaching a small boy to plane a barrel stave straight and true, Gabriel laughing as a girl with her mother's pale hair chased fireflies, Samson lifting a toddler onto his shoulder so the child could touch the sky. They were not memories that belonged to her, yet they settled in her bones as gently as lullabies. When she finally lifted her hands, the cuts had closed to thin white scars shaped like tiny knots. The cup was empty, the bundles reduced to pale dust that sifted through her fingers and vanished. The clearing looked ordinary again, only a ring of cypress knees around a patch of bare earth already sprouting new grass. Behind her the five presences sighed once, a sound like gates long rusted shut finally swinging free, and were gone. The woods were only woods, the morning only morning, and Eliza Thorne walked out carrying nothing but the green leaf folded small in her pocket and the knowledge that some debts can only be paid forward, in open veins and open will.